We're going to go to Fulan. Welcome to Sapience Live.
Assalamu
Assalamu
alaikum.
wa alaikum
Can
salam.
you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so here's my question, inshallah. My question is, it has a bit of context to it. My question is that essentially I was having a conversation with an atheist and they were attempting to disprove the Quran using science, right? And I was explaining how this doesn't really make sense because you can't use the science to disprove the Quran. Because if the Quran says something and it conflicts with the most prevalent scientific theory, it's based on induction, right? And it could be overturned in a few years or something. And you guys know this better than I do, right?
Yeah.
So then he said to me, do you use history to prove the Quran, right? And I said, yes. He said, history is based on induction, right? For example, if there was a bunch of historians, they came together and said, we believe that at the time of Yusuf, alayhi salam, they were called the king, the pharaoh wasn't actually called the pharaoh, it was used as the house, and this is something which is used. This has evidence to it, right? But maybe miraculously it can be turned on its head in a few years and they'll say, oh, we messed up and change their whole prevalent theory. Yeah. So if we can't use the Quran with science to prove it's true because it's not absolutely true, is it not inconsistent that a
Right,
Muslim
so
will use
we,
history? That's
maybe
true.
it's a good point you're making, and it's a good point. It's true that the historical enterprise does depend on some kind of induction. We've never made the argument that we can't use science to talk about the Quran, or that some scientific things are not understood. Like, for example, human being is X, the man is XY chromosome, the woman's XX chromosome. Yeah, we believe that's qat'i. If we didn't believe that was qat'i, and that there was, which means certain, which means there's some possibility that a man can have BXX, and that they're going to overturn that, or that they're going to overturn the fact that man has hormones in his body, or that he's differentiated from the woman, then really we could overturn so many things that we're going to lead to postmodernist ridiculousness. No, it would lead to a kind of postmodernist absurdity. So we are not proposing that because science is filled with induction, therefore science is not something we use. We're saying that a lot of the time when people do the scientific miracle stuff, they make the wrong argument. The arguments that has been historically made about the scientific miracle thing is this couldn't have been known at the time. We're saying that argument is not a good argument because most of the things talked about in the Quran about science, there have been something said somewhere by some civilization in the past. And so that part of it's not a good idea. Well, if you mention some of the theories like the Big Bang Theory, the problem with that is, number one, the ayat are a bit ambiguous. Number two is that there are other theories which you reject, like, for example, Darwinism and stuff like that, even though the evidence could potentially, be said to be, or seen to be at least, the same level as the Big Bang Theory. We're saying that the methodology we've used with science, therefore, is not the best. But there are some things which I personally believe they pass the threshold of acceptability in my eyes. Like, for example, like we said, what constitutes a man, what constitutes a woman, the pregnancy period for a woman. These are all scientific things, by the way, but we don't think they're going to be overturned. We don't think that a woman's pregnancy, they're going to discover something about that. We don't think that about kayan al-rajul, kayan al-mar'a, the form of the man. We don't think that's going to happen. We don't think X, Y, Z. So we say yes, you're right on the basis of probability. So it's always going to be probabilistic reasoning that both of them use induction. However, history has an added advantage, which is that it has a retrospective perspective. Now, let me tell you why this is important. That which has happened in the past is unlikely to change, whereas that which is based on a falsification of the future has more probability to change. For example, string theory. For example, quantum mechanics. For example, the Big Bang theory. For example, the expanding universe. Look at what Roger Penrose was writing 10 years ago about the expanding universe and what he is writing today. There have been changes because the data, this is called theory, it's called underdeterminism, theory ladenness, where you describe the data in different ways, you can interpret it in different ways. Now, we're saying when it comes to historical fact, that the threshold of that being the case is less because these are things that have no propensity to change. So there is a retrospective perspective which is afforded to history or historical enterprise, which unfortunately is not afforded to the scientific enterprise. To give you a very simple example on that point, well, look, 50 years ago. 50 years ago, is that history? Yes, it's history. Some historians would say 50 years ago is history, right? So the Holocaust. Are we sure? Okay, well, there's some speculation in the Holocaust deniers, no problem. But some people are alive and they have witnessed the Second World War. They are still alive and they have witnessed it. Now, the basic question of how did the Second World War happen? That's a basic question. Is that the answer to that question? Is it, and did it happen from the years 1939 to 1945? Is the answer to that question more or less likely to be falsified than the question of is quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen model, more likely or less likely to be disproven in the future? I think you know the answer, and I do as well. So in other words, the retrospective and the hindsight perspective gives more epistemic weight to the historical enterprise than it does to the scientific enterprise. And because the scientific enterprise, according to Karl Popper and the most recent philosophy of science discussions, is based on falsification, which is always going to mean that it's incorrigible and there's some susceptibility to change. Whereas history, though, yes, it's true, there is revisionist history, is less likely, and I'm using the word carefully, to do that, especially on basic matters to do with events that took place. The more further back you go in history, the more vague it gets, of course. But we have to now apply the critical methods, which historians use anyway, and argue on the basis of probability. So it's never been about, well, we're not using induction at all because we think induction is not certain. We don't say that. We use induction, but we use it as a matter of to assert a probabilistic reasoning. And the higher the probability, when it goes over a certain number, then quite frankly, we're not going to reject it. We say that. Yeah. And that's why, by the way, and the evidence of that of the Quran is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَتَرَوُنَّهَا عَيْنَ الْيَقِينِ. You will see it with the eye of yaqeen. So how, if seeing is empiricism, and empiricism is always going to be somewhat inductive, because you're not going to see everything, then Allah is basically telling us the reality of this human condition is that if you see something visually and you experience something, then really the psychology of the human being, you will believe in it. And so therefore, we don't reject and throw out induction, no. We just say that there's a certain threshold that unfortunately a lot of science does not know. And history can do.
Brilliant answer. And I really like the way that Hijab first explained about when people make this straw man argument, and some atheists do this, that we don't use science at all to verify the Quran. Actually, no, the whole argument is that the way it was done previously is false. If there are, for example, intermittent fasting, right? Why shouldn't we talk about the fact that, you know, this type of fasting is now being recommended by doctors twice a week, interestingly enough, right? And, you know, the whole prophetic way of eating when you're hungry, as opposed to just eating in a sort of whenever you feel like
even,
it.
Even, you know, the embryology thing, like, you know, one hadith which sticks out, which has not been used that much in science, I don't even know why not. لَيْسَ الْوَلَدُ مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلِّهِ أَوْ كَمَا قَالَ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. That the born child is not from the entirety of the fluid. What a simple thing. We know it's nutfa amshaj, which means there's tasahum min rajul mar'a, which means that there's genetic contribution from the man and the woman. Yeah. So we know already that it's nutfa amshaj, and then we know now it's not from the whole thing, it's part of that.
Yeah.
So these are very, very important things. I think that hadith and that thing is a very powerful argument for Islam being true.
Absolutely.
To be honest with you.
Absolutely. And another point I think which is worth repeating is that we don't make a hasty generalization of the epistemic weight of all of science. So exactly. We don't say water being H2O is as in flux as string theory. That's again another straw man, because what it is what the issues which contradict the Quran, the scientific theories which contradict the Quran, you will find that they'll always be about these grand paradigm ideas which are susceptible to, as Mohammed Hijab said, theory ladenness, underdetermination, problem of unconceived alternatives, problem of induction, methodological naturalism, restricting the answers which are possible. But when it comes to the everyday practical science, and I think this is super important, you will not really find something in the Quranic discourse which goes against that. And another thing to keep in mind is that when it comes down to these type of ideas, say something like in quantum mechanics, you have the Copernican interpretation or many worlds interpretation or these types of interpretations, those things, you will never find something solid there that they can use to try and challenge the Quran, because those things are in flux. The other thing, distinction which was being made about history and about science, I think is very important, which is that the types of science which are retrospective are more likely to use history in their results. And the reason why is because obviously it's a past event. We're not talking about future events. Future events are much more likely to be susceptible to the problem of induction in terms of your data collection. However, what this atheist was referring to when they were challenging you in this was not to do with problem of induction being applied to observations, but problem of induction being applied to interpretations. Okay, now this is a very important distinction. One's observations, one's interpretations. However, here's a very subtle but important point. The interpretation has a particular paradigm within which you have a different range of results. So for example, historically, we know Napoleon fought in Waterloo. We know that. Now, historians can revise, okay, did he use this strategy? Okay, this guy's personal account we found out was a forgery, but you won't actually change the fundamentals, because that's a historical fact, which, certain things are immutable, like the battle itself and, who won and who didn't. But the interpretations can change. But with science, those things are much more broader.
Malleable.
So malleable, exactly. Jazakallah khair. So whenever people try and use this argument to challenge, our approach, they are basically misusing the fact that most people don't think about these things in a deep way. And initially, it sounds quite plausible. Oh, but history's like this. History uses induction. Science uses induction. Therefore, this. And that's the danger of having a little bit of knowledge.
That's
right. That's
because they're unable to, like, they've got these ideas, but they're unable to critically kind of delineate. Like, for instance, you were just saying something interesting, because it reminded me actually of what Richard Dawkins himself said. He was talking about the theory of evolution. And I don't know if that was in his discussion with Hamza Zulsus, actually, in the streets when Hamza Zulsus was dominating him. But it was before that, when he said, like, well, actually, something to the effect of theory of evolution is like a murder case.
Yes.
And he said that we have to look at the clues, and we have to make our decision as to what happened, right? And I think he said it perfectly, actually, in that analogy. It is like a murder case, but as we know from miscarriages of justice, cold cases, all these kind of things which revived, we know that actually you can get it fundamentally wrong when you're trying to interpret the data. And what we're saying is, we know that there are fossils. We know that there are similarities between creatures anatomically. We know those things. How do you interpret them? How do you interpret what happened here? So the neo-Lamarckian will say something, the genetic
mutationism,
New mutationism. What's the other one? Genetic engineering.
Yeah, natural genetic engineering.
Natural genetic engineering. All of them will have their spin on it. Like, okay, and the new Darwinian will say whatever. They all have their own interpretation. So they're making their own narrative. They're making their own stories, bro. Like, you told me something really interesting one time before. You were telling me what's referred to as just so stories,
Yeah.
And that stuck in my mind. It was a good thing. Maybe you want to explain to the people.
So, Just So Stories is obviously Rudyard Kipling's book, in which, how did the zebra get its stripes? How did the elephant get a long trunk? And they have all these stories, like the crocodile was dragging the elephant, and, it kept getting a long snout. So this was actually a term used to describe the stories that biologists were using to describe traits that we have, genetic, anatomical traits, and how they actually evolved. Because these were stories, which is, I think, very important to understand, are coherent with natural selection. However, they don't have any evidence.
So is it like, for example, you were giving an example before of like why women like pink, because they're cutting the meat and they see the red.
Yeah, exactly. So the Stephen Jay Gould,
and men love blue because they look in the sky when they're hunting gathering or something.
Abdurrahman, can you get me that book, that really big one over there, please? So Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, they were both biologists from Harvard. They basically came up with this term, just so stories, because what they found was that there's lots of stories being given, but they didn't have any evidence, but they were plausible stories. So for example, you come home one day and you find a letter. You find a letter which has your name on it, and you can see that it's come from the gas bill or whatever. Now, one proposition is that the postman came and they actually put the letter in. Another proposition is that the postman came and they delivered it to somebody at the top of the street, and that person picked it up, and then they went all the way down to your house and they put it in, and you thought it was the postman when it was actually this.
Right.
Another possibility is the postman delivered it to house number 2, but then that person came to you. So now you've got an infinite number. The fact is, each one of these stories is coherent. Doesn't mean there's any evidence for it. So what these guys were saying was that there are a lot of stories being given which are coherent, but the stories don't have any evidence. Now, when you look at something like this, like evolution, the first 4 billion years, this is Michael Roos and E.O. Wilson and all the rest, you'll find actually any particular thing. How is it that human beings like have a certain preference for colors? So they'll say, okay, we'll have this certain preference for colors because back in the time when we were hunter-gatherers, men who were more predisposed to like the color blue, because the sky is blue, because the watering hole is blue, are more likely to survive. And you'll get literally volumes of these types of stories, which you'll find in all types of evolutionary books. However, the problem is they are equally plausible alternatives, just like the postman, n+1, but none of them can be adjudicated. Hence why they are pure just so stories. Now, this doesn't mean that one of them is not true, because the idea that the postman delivered to your door is way more likely than somebody accidentally gave it to the top of the street and then it came to you. However, so there is one right answer and there's possibly many wrong answers, but what's super important is that for the vast majority of people, because they're very simple, a coherent story they will interpret as evidence. And that's why the just so story term was so popular that now today it's actually becoming into an academic term. It's actually referred to in journals, in books, in lectures. Just so stories is now an academic term. Initially it was a ridicule of the Darwinist position, but now it's evolved.
So in summary, therefore, what you're saying is actually, there's a difference between the observable, number one, and the interpretation of the observable. And the interpretation of the observable is subject or susceptible to a variety of different interpretations. And this is the problem of undetermination.
And each interpretation...
Would you say that correctly? Undetermination.
Undetermination. Except that each particular story is internally consistent. And people mistake internal consistency for evidence. Because let's say you go to a police, right? Somebody robbed you or you're being accused of murder. The police will try and find inconsistencies. If they find that you're consistent, it seems your testimony has weight. So human beings normally associate consistency with truth. But consistency could be just a very consistent story. It's not necessary that that story is true. So truth requires consistency as a necessary condition, but not sufficient condition. So that's why it's too important.
I just wanted to leave one thing, please.
Sure.
Because you mentioned, from everything I've gathered, and it was very, very beneficial. Like, I've actually not heard the answer to this before, that for science, it's very true that you can't compare string theory to the fact that we are male and female and have different chromosomes, right? So do you have a sort of criteria, or have you come up and constructed the threshold? How do you say it? Threshold?
Threshold. Now, you're right to ask that question. Okay, what is the threshold? Here's what I would think is the reasonable psychological threshold, and it comes back to what you were saying, Subboor, before about what we expect in everyday life. The threshold we want the atheist interlocutor or the skeptic interlocutor to use is the same exact threshold he uses in his everyday life in decision making. We are calling them out for having a psychological double standard. We're exposing that double standard. Actually, epistemic justification comes very naturally, all right? You exist right now because you're talking to me. You might have money in your pocket. You might not see it, but you might feel it. And that for you is enough to determine that the money's in your pocket. You might have books in your shelf. The last time you saw them, they were there. You might not have them there anymore. but you're assuming that they are there, and that's an inference. These assumptions that we are making are natural, and we don't even think twice about them. Otherwise, we would actually literally go mad. A true skeptic is somebody who belongs in the mental institute, by the way. It's someone who is skeptical about everything that happens in their life and they're not unsure. Someone who lives that life is psychologically unstable person. Do you know that? Like a true skeptic on every life decision would be psychologically troubled.
And you know what's very interesting about this? When I was at university and we were doing moral philosophy, the professor mentions a point which was actually very profound, but he did it in a very mundane way, right? What he basically said is, the arguments for moral skepticism are the strongest in philosophy, yet they are rejected by the majority of philosophers, even though their arguments haven't been addressed, which shows that the philosophers themselves are not really following that philosophical skepticism. They're rather more fitri. They rather believe in some form of moral objectivity.
Well, you're talking about moral skepticism. Here we're talking about epistemic skepticism.
Yeah, no, the reason why I was saying that is because skepticism, whether it's moral, existential, or whatever, it's always going to be an impractical philosophy.
Right.
So even with this case, when they're using this type of skepticism in epistemology, they will not be able to be consistent with this, just like the moral philosophers won't be able to be consistent in this regard, because we always have to ask this question: is this argument that the person is using a double-edged sword?
Yeah.
And if it's a double-edged sword, just show them it's cutting you as well.
I think that's the same thing with postmodernism, to be honest with you, because it's the whole thing of how I understand postmodernism is deconstructing meta-narratives. If you want to put it in the sentence, right?
Good.
That's how I understand it. So I don't think many people understand what postmodernism is. Some people think it's Marxism. It's not. It's a completely different ideology, right? And anyway, it's the same problem, because like one of my refutations, which has not been given as much exposure, perhaps, is when I was refuting the third wave feminists and Judith Butler in particular. And I found it, and this actually started off as an essay, and it got really high grades. The woman was a transgender herself, although, they were, whatever, how she wants to identify, was a transgender. But she recognized the force of the argument. I put it into the book, the Fifth Wave Feminist book that I wrote, which is basically this. It's like, I was reading what Judith Butler was saying that everything was a social construct, like race is a social construct. Like, she didn't say, but biology, things like biological. In my reading, she's saying that sex is a social construct, right? And then when this might sound like completely peripheral or tangential, potentially even not related, but then I started reading what she was talking about, the Palestine-Israel conflict, and she was referring to them as Palestinians. She's on our side, let's say, for that. I was happy with that, obviously, but then on the other hand, I was thinking, why is she mentioning Palestinians and Israelis in that language? Because that is to categorize them according to a transcendental or some kind of right. It's some kind of genus.
Some sort of ontological category.
Yeah. So what I'm saying here is that you in everyday life, you're compelled to think that there is some demarcating factor between person or people X and people Y, but in your skeptical or postmodern pontification, you're very very, very delicate when it comes to the matter of differentiation when it comes to sex and gender. So you want to have your cake and eat it both. The truth of the matter is, you can't really speak about racism unless we speak about race, and we can't speak about race until we talk about biology. And we can't talk about biology if you're a postmodernist and you deny it. But if the same thing applies now with sex and gender. I remember being I don't know if I told you the story before. I was in the elevator one time, and there was a woman who was part of the course as well, doing gender studies stuff. And she just, for some reason, she blurted something out. She said, I believe that sex, like actually have penetrative sex, like intimacy, right? Intercourse. She says, I believe that sex is a social construct. So there was only like 10 seconds left before I got out the lift. I thought, she's saying something ridiculous. Let me say something ridiculous too. I looked at her, I said, in that case, then rape is a social construct.
Oh,
because they don't realize
Ouch.
the ramifications of what they're saying. If you say that sex is a social construct, now rape becomes social. If you say that race is social, racism becomes a social construct. If you say that gender is a social construct, then patriarchy becomes
in the words which capture this really well, if you make an uncomfortable bed, you have to lie in it.
Wow, man, when you coming up with these words, you writing them down?
No,
Huh?
these are just
Things
things you pick up when you read and stuff.
No.
Jazakallah khair, guys. I'm gonna
Jazakallah khair, brother Fulan.